darn it. I wanted the music to keep going. Hey, Lynn, how's it going?
Hey, sorry. Well, you can have the music going. Sorry.
No, no, no. It's because I unmuted myself. I shouldn't have done that, but that's okay. It's all
I
good.
was I was trying to test my mic. That's all. Sounds like you can hear me well.
Yeah, yeah, it's coming through clearly, so it's fantastic. I am inviting up Akansha as well. I see Keith. I'm going to invite up Keith as well. Hello, Graham. Hello, Siddhant. Welcome, welcome. Hey, Akansha.
Hey Marino. Hey Lynn. Hey everybody.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, Keith. How's it going? We are doing all right.
Fantastic.
I normally have the music going on for a few minutes before the space starts, and I accidentally unmuted myself and I killed the music. And there's no way to turn it back on.
Oh,
I
Sadness.
yeah, and I also don't want to just suddenly turn on a YouTube channel or a video and play music that way because then the copyright folks will come after me. So yeah.
oh. So how did you have the music in the first place? Did you create the music
No,
yourself?
so in Twitter Spaces, there is a built-in music function. So the moment you start the space, there's an option to turn it on, and it comes on for a bit as long as you're muted.
I see. Very cool.
Yeah, let's give it a few more minutes. We're waiting on Kat as well as Louie, and I think a few more folks will join us as well. And this is recorded, so folks that aren't able to get to it this morning, they can catch it later on or anytime because the recording's available unlimitedly. One thing that we're trying to do is find an appropriate system or software out there that lets us convert these spaces into YouTube videos. And all that software out there is ridiculously expensive. I remember Akansha was investigating one solution, and it was like I think 40 to 60 bucks per instance or something like that. So we've got to get a little creative and figure out ways to turn this into a YouTube video. I've invited up Kat as well. I know Kat tends to like to join from the desktop, so hopefully they're on their phone. Graham is suggesting that I sing for y'all. No, that's not my that's not my jam. I don't sing. I only speak. So, is everyone ready for Halloween? Lynn, are you all ready for Halloween? Do you celebrate Halloween?
Not really, because my kids are big now. So yeah, so cherish those moments when your kids
Yeah.
are small.
Yeah. Yeah. Keith, how about you?
Sorry, I was I was quote tweeting Marino's message about the space, and I had to delete my save my draft and put put the space back into focus. I don't know. My wife isn't feeling super great, so we had a couple of Halloween plans, but we just might end up watching Dancing with the Stars and watch their costumes instead.
That is a perfect plan. Nice, easy, chill night. Turn off the lights so no one hits up your door and bothers you.
Exactly. Just just maybe put some candy out on the front porch and just let the kids have at it.
Right. Yeah. Um, I am not sure where Louie is. I think Kat just dropped off because she's having some issues with audio, so hopefully she'll join shortly. But I think we can go ahead and get started anyways. So, welcome everyone. We're going to talk about Ambient Mesh, and it's not an introductory to Ambient Mesh. I think we do that plenty enough. I think what's most important now is really understanding how to take Ambient Mesh and bring that to production or bring it to your production systems, but also understand some of the motivations behind why Ambient Mesh today, why it's important, and then understand the engineering mindset behind it. And, we have the two most important, now we have three because Louis just showed up, but we have the three most important folks of the Istio project, of the Service Mesh project, Istio. And they've heavily contributed in so many ways. They've added so much value to the organization of the CNCF. They've also brought so many great ideas, taken the feedback that the community has brought forth and made what Ambient Mesh is today. So let's go ahead and get some introductions going. And Louis, if you're on your desktop, I don't think you're going to have a chance to be able to come up and speak. So you're going to have to do this on your phone. Um, So I'll give you a few moments to go ahead and do that. I'll turn it over to Lynn to go ahead and introduce herself. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here. So my name is Lin Sang. I've been a very long time Istio contributor, one of the founding member in the Istio community. So most recently, have been working with the community on drive ambient to production ready, hopefully soon. So as far as affiliation, my other job is I work at Solo. I'm leading the Solo open source team in addition to my Istio work.
Awesome.
That's all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lynn. Also, you're going to be at KubeCon next week, right?
Yes, I will be there. I'm so excited. Not excited about the weather though, but I'm excited to meet everybody there.
Awesome. Yeah, you've got quite a number of sessions, if I'm not mistaken, and your week is going to be pretty packed. So I'm excited for you, there to support you. Anything you need, let us know. We're here for you. Keith, are you back? Are you able to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry, I had some weird audio output issues. But hey, everybody, I'm Keith. I am the lead for open source Istio at Microsoft, and I have been involved with the project for about a year at this point, and spend a lot of time working in Istio networking and designing various features, and have put a lot of effort and energy into the Ambient project. So we're excited to chat with everybody and have a not so spooky discussion around Ambient Mesh.
I love it. Thanks so much, Keith. Also, you're going to be at KubeCon as well. So what sessions are you presenting?
Yeah, I will be at KubeCon. Just one session for me this year. I'm going to be hosting a panel around service mesh trade-offs. I think the title is something around service mesh battle scars. Lynn will be one of my esteemed panelists. Yes, very excited. And we're going to be talking to mesh practitioners across the ecosystem with representatives from Cilium Mesh as well as Linkerd, and of course Lynn and John on John Howard on the Istio side. So come if you're at KubeCon, or if you happen to catch the recordings afterward. We'd love for you to tune in. We're going to have a lot of great discussions around eBPF, secure transport, and various other mesh trade-offs. So should be a fun time.
Awesome, Keith. Thanks so much for sharing that. And Louis, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Why don't you introduce
yourself? Everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm Louis Ryan. I've been with the Istio project since the Istio project became a thing. I sit on the TOC of Istio with Lynn. I work a lot with Keith and other folks. Obviously, Ambient Mesh being the kind of new hotness in the Istio space. There's been quite a bit of time on that over the last 2 to 3 years, I suppose. I work for Solo, but prior to working at Solo, I was at Google for quite a long time. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Louis. You've also got some presence at KubeCon. Are you speaking there as well?
Yes, I am co-presenting with John Howard, a kind of roadmappy and overview of Istio presentation, whose title I can't quite remember, but don't blame me for that. It's still a week to go.
Hey, it gets the best of us. I don't even remember the titles of my own talks right now. So we're all in heads down trying to get ready for KubeCon next week. And also we've got Kat from Pulumi. Kat, welcome back to our Twitter Spaces. If you can do a quick reintroduction to everyone, and we can get going.
Sure, absolutely. So I won't be at KubeCon, but I'm already feeling the FOMO because there's some awesome sessions, it sounds like, just even on the mesh side. But my name is Kat Morgan. I am a developer advocate at Pulumi. So orchestration is the name of the game. And mesh is always a fun component of that. My background is infrastructure, and my Kuma Mesh has been my primary exposure to service mesh. But excited for the space. Thanks for having me.
So, welcome everyone. I'm Akansha, and thanks for joining us today. So, let's start with the very first question. And so as the creators and maintainers of Ambient Mesh, can you share some insights into the inspiration behind developing this project? What specific challenges or pain points were you looking to address? Anybody would like to start?
I guess I'll start. I was waiting to see
Yeah.
who wants to start first. Yeah, so Ambient Mesh was launched, I believe, on September 7th last year, which is actually celebrate Ambient's first birthday. So when we started to create the Ambient project, Ambient Mesh, we were trying to target the general sentiment around Istio, that Istio was very complex. And I'm sure many of you seen the tweets about, look, oh my gosh, Sidecar is consume more than 50% of my infrastructure resources, my cloud resources. So there are a little bit general sentiment around, look, the moment I drag the sidecar with me, my application stops working if I'm not fitting like the application requirements of Istio sidecar. So there's actually a laundry list of things that's not compatible with sidecar, right? So for instance, Kubernetes jobs. We had many of our users in the community trying to run Kubernetes jobs with sidecar, and they find out not compatible. The other example I can give is many of our developers have applications which have their own sidecars, and then they find out their own sidecars have trouble to interrupt with Istio sidecar or our init container. So that make their application not functioning, or takes quite some time for them to orchestrate the life cycle between their sidecar with the Istio's sidecar and the Istio's init container. So then we start to think about, what about the users that looked at Istio and actually walked away from Istio because of the sentiment of complexity of sidecar, and that's when Ambient was born. And at Solo, we started conversation with Google. I believe Louis, you one of the key person from the Google team we talked to, and we had kind of reach a lot of similar thoughts on the right architecture to enable a user without sidecar. So Louis, I'd like to transfer to you to see if you want to add different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. Obviously, we were, Istio was the first kind of comprehensive, like, let's implement all the features service mesh solution in the market, right? When zero trust, observability, traffic management, all of those kinds of things. But that, just because we ship with sidecar doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at other options. And there were some real and, fair commentary in the ecosystem about complexity, operations, resource cost footprint. And, we've been hearing those things for quite some time, and, obviously thinking about what was the best way to try and address these things. And you don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater when you're looking at like new architectures. Like, there was a lot of time and thought put into what the next iteration of the architecture for Istio should be. The one thing that was clear is that there should be an iteration. And so there were kind of these concurrent thought processes going on inside of Google and Solo at around the same time. And by happy circumstance, we happened to have a conversation about them, and that led pretty quickly to the teams working together and trying to create a solution that would systematically address the concerns in a way that we thought would still maintain, in particular, the security properties of the system. Right. I mean, you can't be a service mesh and claim to do zero trust and then not really be secure.
Keith, would you like to add on to what Louis and Lynn said? And thanks for sharing.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, the big use case that's intriguing with Ambient Mesh is the ability to kind of allow a easier and simpler way to onboard to Service Mesh. For all of the different properties and features that you see in the Service Mesh ecosystem, a lot of the feedback that I've seen during my time in the industry is that it's really complex. Len mentioned some of the pitfalls with jobs and resource utilization and such at the beginning, and it's in addition to those, it's also a lot to try to wrap your brain around and implement if you just need, for example, secure transport for some sort of compliance regulation within your industry. And so for me, the exciting part about Ambient Mesh is the ability to be able to get some of those low-hanging fruits, some of those widely needed feature sets like secure transport, MTLS authentication, and things of that nature, as authentication in addition to encryption. And be able to get that in a way that has relatively low cost to you, it's even more transparent than the Service Mesh, which kind of propagated this idea of a transparent networking and transparent redirection. So that's kind of the big win for me back when I was trying to implement Service Mesh. If I had the ability to just get MTLS with relatively low investment from my end, that's really easy calculus in my mind.
It's interesting, to hear different perspectives on this topic, and I will pass on to Kat if you would like to add some thoughts to it.
Yeah, I actually am approaching it a little bit more with a question right now. Just one of the things that I like about Kubernetes in general is we're getting further into the maturity of different APIs and CRDs and such. And so kind of like we saw with API Gateway and Gateway API, adding more consistency across many different API gateways, I'm a little bit curious how our guest speakers today especially would see Ambient Mesh in light of that story of generalization and improving just the predictability and comfort of average Kubernetes operations team being able to pick up Ambient Mesh for the first time as opposed to the more traditional sidecar architecture.
I mean, I guess in an ideal world, we'd like infrastructure and APIs to kind of be church and state, right? We'd like them to be separate, but we also have to recognize that, things evolve in the ecosystem, right, at overlapping periods of time, right? The fact that the Gateway API and Ambient Mesh are kind of co-evolving in time and space, they're, in many ways, they're independent efforts, but because they're coming to market at the same time, there's interest in them cooperating, right? That's pretty important, right? If you look at standardization efforts in the Service Mesh space over the years, Istio took the approach of, let's be comprehensive and kind of be a reference implementation. There were other kind of more, I guess, multi-vendor standard-driven efforts that, for various reasons didn't quite pan out. And it, certainly seemed to me at the time that Kubernetes itself was probably the best standardization vehicle for APIs in this space. And the features of Service Mesh intrinsically are overlapping with, the features of traditional reverse proxies and forward proxies, which is what the Gateway API was initially targeting. And so it was a pretty obvious step to, try and find a way to bring those APIs into the Service Mesh context in the way that allowed people to reuse their, knowledge investments in learning APIs and learning how to automate them, how to compose them, right? In particular with the Gateway API, where composability is a big and important feature. And so it was pretty obvious that a dedicated effort should go into that. And then you look at people adopting new technologies, new infrastructure, whatever it might be. If you can give them or recommend to them a more future-proof way of doing that, that's both the infrastructure and the API. It's probably in the best long-term interests of users to start following that path. And so it seemed to make sense to say, look, when we ship Ambient Mesh, we will ship it with a version of the Gateway API that's known as Gamma, that's dedicated to the Service Mesh use case. And for people who see the value in the long-term investment in that API, that they have a clear path forward. And Keith, who's probably, some of my first interactions with Keith were actually around the Gateway API, and that's, how he, I guess, in some ways, he and I got to start knowing each other. Keith was very early involved in those discussions about, bringing standardizations via Gamma to the mesh space in Istio in particular.
Yeah, that's exactly how it happened. So for some context, I was involved with one of those standardization efforts that Louis kind of alluded to at the beginning around, it was called Service Mesh Interface, and it was seeking to try to create some neutral ways so that Kubernetes operators didn't have to go learn the CRDs and APIs for Linkerd, the APIs for Istio, the APIs for Nginx, Consul, Kuma, and there's just this proliferation as different teams and organizations and projects look to innovate. And so SMI was an effort to try to sort of start centralizing rather, and create some standards that operators could depend on and not have to learn all these various different configuration APIs. Like Louis said, there are several reasons why it didn't pan out, but I think that's one of the things to take away from this, and one of the things that I kind of, how I met Louis and kind of came to some of the Istio community with these ideas, is that Kubernetes was already moving in the direction with the Gateway API specifically for north-south traffic, for the ingress use case and taking traffic from outside the cluster, bringing it in outside the cluster into the cluster. And those APIs, when you look at them, are very generic on purpose. And the folks who've been leading that effort for multiple years have been doing a fantastic job at designing very multi-purpose, backwards compatible APIs. And so they're looking at them, they worked pretty well with very little tweaking and modification for what we call the east-west use case, or service mesh traffic from pod to pod within a cluster. And so last July, we began the Gamma initiative to take those resources and standardize them for the mesh use case. And now here we are, in about a year's time, we were able to come up with a set of semantics for that east-west use case without having to make any API changes. And so how does that impact Istio? Well, Istio, was one of the first meshes to implement the specification for mesh within Gateway API. And now bringing that back to Ambient, we do see, I think, a lot of opportunity, especially as the time goes on. We hope to see maybe some standardization, more adoption of the Ambient pattern, potentially. And purposefully, we designed the pattern and the technology and the infrastructure to utilize open protocols such as HTTP Connect, and such as mutual TLS, these protocols that have been around and are very widely adopted. And now with the Kubernetes, with this API specification that is also pretty general and also pretty well adopted, I think there's a lot of opportunity to see some standardization so that at the end of the day, the Kubernetes operator doesn't have to have this cognitive burden of having to learn yet another set of APIs.
Keith touched on an interesting point, actually. So, obviously we talk a lot about user-facing APIs and operators and the operational experience, and that's, a huge part of the focus in Ambient. And, I think, I've given presentations on this. I've seen other people give presentations on this, right? The operational simplicity that you get from Ambient in comparison to a traditional sidecar-based model, right? It's really pretty radical. Right, upgrade experiences, installation experiences. As Keith mentioned earlier, the ability to just go into a cluster and get MTLS turned on in the matter of less than minutes is pretty compelling. And so if I had to say the primary driver of Ambient, that was probably it. But there are lots of these other kind of additional things that we were looking to do. We talked about resource utilization improvements. That was a pretty high up on that list as well. The idea of crawl, walk, run, right? The fact that you could absorb or get a specific feature for only the amount of complexity that it requires to implement that feature. And so if you just want MTLS, then you get a simpler set of infrastructure than you get if you want MTLS and HTTP and Kafka parsing and WASM and auth policy integration. And those are all kind of focused at the user and operations level, but there are also these kind of broad standardization, like make the industry better type of things that we're also kind of doing in the background. Gamma is one. This obviously kind of straddles that line, but also the data path stuff. For those who've looked at the ambient documentation, one of the things you'll probably notice is that we don't have a proprietary technology for sending traffic around over MTLS. We use what is colloquially known as WebSockets, right? It's it's a very performant version of WebSockets that we do, but it's effectively WebSockets. And that, in the long run, will allow Ambient Mesh to interoperate at the data plane level with other pieces of infrastructure, which we think is quite important because, people have pretty diverse environments. They run multi-cloud or multi-cloud and on-premise, and they have a lot of different things they need to connect. And so, if you align with widely adopted standards, things that the IETF specifies, right, you have a better chance of being able to meet those requirements.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, I saw you have a hand. I was waiting for you. The only thing I guess I would add while Louis and Keith was talking to highlight this mutual TLS, right? That's the most popular feature. People adopt service mesh. And if you just adopt Ambient for mutual TLS, you're actually way more secure in a sense, right? Because one of the things about sidecar is you always drag the sidecar, even though you only need layer 4 functionality, which may be just mutual TLS, right? So with Ambient, what's unique about slicing the 2 layers into the secure overlay layer and the layer 7 processing layer, you could potentially just adopt a mutual TLS and not to worry about any of the CVE. That's layer 7 processing from Envoy, which are most of the CVEs. So that's a super fun aspect I want to highlight.
That's awesome. One thing I also wanted to bring up, as we're standardizing with the Gateway API spec and Gamma, Kubernetes 1.28 released this sidecar KEP that effectively treats sidecars as pretty priority resources inside of Kubernetes, which allows you to treat, let's say, the Istio sidecar as an init container to allow it to complete before your application comes online. So how does this impact the consumption and adoption of Ambient Mesh if this sidecar enhancement makes it easy to consume regular Istio?
I mean, I have my own opinions, but the scheduling aspect of the sidecar is just one of the problems of the sidecar pattern, right? Probably the biggest problem is stranded reservation or over reservation, right? If you think about the Kubernetes scheduler, right, its job is to look at the resource requirements of a deployment and try to figure out a way to bin packet onto a bunch of fixed resource, capable machines, and it does a pretty admirable job of it. Sidecars, because of the way Kubernetes work or the way Kubernetes deployments work, right, you have to reserve a certain amount of resource for the sidecar in addition to what you reserve for the application. And it's operational overhead for a user or an administrator of a Kubernetes cluster to know on an application by application basis how much resource the sidecar needs to be able to do its job, right, working on behalf of the application. And so what we often see, because Istio just picks a default, that default is either too much or too little, and it leads to some pretty significant inefficiencies and or production headaches for people, right, as they try to scale up or scale down the sidecar to try to fit into the application need. And applications are also dynamic, right? So sometimes they need a lot and sometimes they need a little, right? And it could vary by location or time of day or all these types of things. And so it just makes the allocation process, which in the Kubernetes model is pretty static, difficult, right? And that can actually lead to quite a significant amount of inefficiency. We don't have that problem in Ambient, or we have a much reduced version of that problem because of the way the infrastructure works. And so we're just in general able to get to much higher resource utilizations in the Ambient pattern. Then the other thing I would say is that, while some of the scheduling aspects for sidecar have been improved, there are still gaps, right? And I suggest people go read the KEP and the commentary on the KEP and what was and was not solved in that proposal. So it should, for people who want to continue using sidecars, it should make their life a little bit better. Istio had already solved most of these problems for the most part, so it won't radically improve the situation for existing sidecar users. But it shows that a commitment on the part of Kubernetes, at least to make sidecars easier for other people to implement, and to get sidecars to play more nicely with each other, which is probably more important, actually.
Yeah, I would also add, in fact, John Howard from Istio community already added sidecar support for the Istio project. So a big caveat, though, I think this feature is still relatively new, right? I think it's experimental, if I remember correctly, and it requires a new version of Kubernetes 1.28, if I remember correctly. So you would have to have the newer version to be able to leverage this. And then back to the point I was making earlier, right? So if you continue to use sidecar, you wouldn't be able to leverage like the resource saving, and also you are essentially paying for layer 7 processing if you don't need that functionality, right? Because you don't have that slicing the layer between the two. So you literally drag your sidecar regardless of what function you need out of your service mesh. So that's the other potential issue. And then the other thing I would see is maybe some compatibility issues with sidecar, right? Because before Kubernetes formally supports the sidecar KEP, people are doing sidecars today, right? So what about they have legacy sidecar, now they need to move to this new sidecar. So there's a lot of things they have to think through, and how does that impact with Istio's new way to support adopting the new sidecar approach from Kubernetes. So there's a lot of compatibility interrupt you have to work through as well. In addition to newer version of Kubernetes as a requirement to even just explore all these.
One more thing I also think is relevant to add to add on to Lynn's point about this being requiring a new version of Kubernetes. My understanding is that the sidecar KEP feature is still alpha, which means that you would have to turn it on during Kubernetes installation. And a lot of, depending on the vendor or cloud provider that you're using, you might not even have the ability to turn it on until the next Kubernetes release that is as of yet unreleased. So again, it's an excellent point. I love the engineering from Kubernetes ecosystem to make sidecars actually tenable from operations perspective. And I'm looking forward to see how the support continues to grow over the next couple of versions of Kubernetes. It's definitely something that has needed to be solved for a long time. And it's something to be excited about. I am excited about it. But for you folks listening, folks who are running Kubernetes for their production applications, it'll still take a little bit longer, I think, for it to percolate and be ready for you to consume in a production manner.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I was wrong. It is alpha and it's gated by future gates. So you have to enable it during your install of your Kubernetes cluster to enable sidecar container feature gate. Yeah, thanks, Kiss.
Yeah, so I had one question. So, like, we are witnessing debates over sidecar proxies and sidecarless models. So I would like to know your insights that how these two approaches can coexist within the same service mesh ecosystem, and like what technical or operational considerations should organizations keep in mind when deciding to use both approaches in their deployments.
So I mean, I guess there's probably, like all things, right? Ambient is still new-ish. If people are happily running along in production with sidecars today, they have all their operational ducks in a row, they have the features that they want, then for them, the operational benefits that would exist for a new user may be less relevant, right? And so, certainly in the Istio community, we're very cognizant of that fact and want to make sure that, we continue to support the sidecar based usage model as is. We've already done a lot of work to ensure that sidecar-based workloads and ambient-based workloads can kind of communicate with each other at the data plane level. And standardization of the protocols that was discussed earlier certainly helps significantly with that. And we obviously share a common infrastructure base with Envoy, right? So that makes that work tractable, and we have high confidence that we can do that. So, if you're a net new user and you're trying to decide between Ambient and Sidecar, I think the choice is probably a little bit easier. For net new users, we think, just from the get-go, Ambient will be significantly easier for you to maintain and upgrade. So this conversation is mostly for existing Istio users, right? And performing an assessment of where they are in their operational maturity for the existing sidecar model and/or their appetite for change. Keith, I see you got a hand up.
Yeah, agree with everything that you just mentioned, Louis. I think when it comes to the sidecar versus sidecarless question that organizations are evaluating, I think the first step in general when selecting a mesh, whether you're looking at Istio specifically or not, is to understand what the requirements are for your organization and how those requirements might grow over time. So if, for example, if let's say you're in a highly regulated industry, it's been around for a decade or two, and you've got established patterns for how you want to do your, L7 routing based on headers and such, and you just need something to abstract the MTLS, so you don't have to mess with the certificates. Then that, a sidecarless approach where you can just have the layer slice. I like that language from Lynn, where you can just have that L4 slice of the functionality and of the complexity in your cluster, and utilize the existing investments that your organization's already made. That's a really nice fit. If you're kind of newer to the cloud native ecosystem, or newer to the industry in general, and you don't have these patterns, maybe you're a startup and you need some of, right now it needs MTLS for encryption, but that blue-green traffic management or canary deployments powered by something transparent in your cluster, something you might want to use, then that's some different calculus. Again, Ambient allows you to slice the layers, and sidecar might be beneficial for you. You might not have as much, you might not care as much about the operational aspect of it at this point, because you're able to design it from the beginning. You don't have existing Kubernetes deployments or what have you. But I think the overarching thing that folks should keep in mind is that, especially once you start getting to that layer 7 functionality where you're doing things with HTTP, headers, response modifiers, grabbing JWT things, once you start getting to that territory, there's actually kind of a jump in complexity that you have to price in at some point. Either that complexity comes into your application via your client libraries, like we did for a long time before Kubernetes and Service Mesh really took off. The complexity can exist there. The complexity can exist in a sidecar that handles a lot of that stuff for you. But as we've already discussed, you might not be able to opt out of that layer 7 complexity if I use L4 stuff. Or, some other sidecarless patterns that we see out in the wild will, still offer sidecarless, but they'll put that layer 7 functionality in the node somewhere, handling the traffic management from one place to another. And the potential issue there is going to be, again, complexity surface being done in the node, any potential security vulnerabilities. So it's really just I think the way I like to think about sidecar versus sidecarless is just matching your appetite for complexity with the stage you are in your organization's growth and adoption and what your requirements are.
Yeah, I guess I would definitely add, I agree with what Louis and Keith said. I would definitely add, so I assume we're giving the answer based on the assumption, right? Both are production ready. So right now, Sidecar is definitely production ready, right? It's being deployed to hundreds and thousands organization. Well, Ambient, we're still trying to explore or one of the first or the first few users running Ambient in production, right? We're still working with users trying to figure out who would be the right candidates and, what the feedback they are. So the feedback we're giving is based on, both are production ready. And I would add a very interesting twist I observed myself. So we talk about traffic shifting, right? Rolling out new version is one of the canary update your application, right? Is one of the interesting function of Istio today with Service Mesh without you needing to making any code changes in your application. So what Ambient really make it even interesting is I could potentially deploy a waypoint proxy, which is the layer 7 processing layer we talk about, right? Just when I need it for the rollout of my new application, right? So I can do my doc launching, canary testing to feel comfortable, rolling out to the new version. And once the new version is all the traffic completely rolled over, and I remove the old version, I no longer need that waypoint, which is super cool, right? So we talk about resource saving in that context. If I don't have any layer 7 functionality I could potentially not even needing that waypoint. So we could potentially have this like temporary waypoint for the purpose of serving the rollout, which I would not be able to do with sidecar today, right? You always have the sidecar, even unless you don't need any function of the mesh.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I can't believe like the wealth of information already being knowledge dropped today. But just to kind of rewind, so some of the Gamma stuff that was mentioned, in case anyone listening isn't up to speed, and this was pretty new to me recently. Gamma is, I believe that acronym was Gateway API for Mesh Management and Administration. So that's where we're seeing some of the like mesh functionalities driven into Gateway API spec, I believe. And then this waypoint piece, and Lynn, you were bringing that up, is really, 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 really interesting to me as a platform operator, just because if I'm understanding that right, that's where mesh or the ambient mesh gets the namespace specific. It's almost like a sidecar for a namespace as opposed to sidecar for specific pods. Is that, am I understanding kind of an overgeneralized explanation of the waypoint?
Yeah, that's
correctly.
Way to think about it. So basically you have a layer 7 processing based on the tenant scope. You feel comfortable, right? So that tenant scope in your example would be at the namespace level. You can also to have it a bit more granular. So you could have a layer 7 processing waypoint for your service account, right? If you feel like service account is more granular and you feel more comfortable enough, that's the right tenant scope for you. But most people probably would be okay with the namespace scope. And it's kind of like a sidecar, right? But the reality is it's not running along with your application pod within your pod network namespace, right? You actually have it as a separate deployment. It's a separate Kubernetes service as well. So you can think about it. It's really like a layer 7 processing gateway, right? For whichever scope you choose. And the default scope is the namespace scope.
Yeah, a good mental model for a lot of people will be just a waypoint is a namespace ingress that all traffic is guaranteed to go through, right? So the lower level part, the MTLS part, or what you could kind of think of the network layer, guarantees that it will send traffic through that gateway. And then that gateway is configured by the people responsible for that namespace, right? So you can put your routing rules and policies and things like that. Much like for cluster ingress, right? Somebody else would be responsible for that, obviously. But there's a boundary around the edge of the cluster. And the network admins make sure that all traffic coming into the cluster goes in through the ingress gateway. So it's kind of, we're just turtling all the way down into namespaces at this point. And it's not a bad mental model for actually how this works. The hard part was getting the guarantee that all the traffic would go through it. And that's why we have the other layer of the infrastructure. And then there's some other obviously interesting bits and pieces about actual zero trust and security. But it's not a bad mental model for people kind of wrapping their heads around what ambient is at a very kind of high level view.
Keith, okay, Marino, please go ahead.
Oh, if Keith wanted to add something to that, feel free to, Keith, and then I can go ahead.
No, Louis and Len covered it. Y'all feel free to go ahead.
Okay, so my next question is something to do with network engineering and the way we used to build networks. In fact, like we still kind of build networks the very same way. When I look at Ambient and I start looking at the way we have a deployment model in Ambient Mesh, it's very resemblant of that gateway pattern you would see at a branch office or in a data center environment. And it's also very resemblant of the usage of something like IPsec, where you would define workloads that needed to be captured and pushed into a tunnel. Now, when you think of Ambient Mesh, who do you think would be the best consumers of this technology? Would it be the network engineers out there that are already building out these networks at layer 4 and below, or would it be more of the platform teams that have to own this?
I think that there are arguments that can be made for both. The big difference, I think, between your traditional network engineers who are building out these, whether it's data center networks or your cloud virtual networks, VPCs, et cetera, and your platform team is, in my opinion, it's going to boil down to vocabulary and tooling. And so one of the big changes with that Kubernetes has kind of enabled in the infrastructure domain is for people to be able to change their infrastructure in a declarative way and use, I'll say, traditionally more accessible, or what we tend to assume is more accessible configuration, like from YAML to even code, writing applications and operators with client Go. So when it comes to the most appropriate consumer for Ambient Mesh, I think there's potentially learning that can happen in both directions. A network engineer learning the vocabulary and the tooling for Kubernetes, but also your typical platform engineers like myself who haven't been around, don't have that exposure to the network engineering use case as much, to learn these patterns and to see that this is really just architecture and protocols that we've been using for 10, 15, maybe even 20 years in some cases, just packaged and composed in a different way. So I think depending on where an organization is strongest and already has existing investment, that organization should utilize that investment in the way that makes the most sense with their requirements and timelines, and then share that knowledge all the way up and down the stack. So if they've got a platform team, but they've got this very wide array of network engineers, then maybe it makes sense for the network engineers to go and do that build out and learn a bit, and then transfer that learning upward throughout the organization. And the same can happen in the other direction. It's my take anyway.
Yeah, I would agree with that in overall. Certainly Istio in the sidecar-based model, I think the answer would have been much more clearly the platform engineer. It wasn't a goal to be that siloed, right? Like certainly one of the things that we talk, or kind of a catchphrase we use sometimes, which may be a little bit flippant, is networking for applications, not network administrators. And it's really just the idea that the network needs to do more to help application developers manage their applications in production. Right, whether it was layering in security features or adding observability, these were things that problems that application developers were having to handle on a silo by silo basis, and it was very expensive to do it. And if the network took on those responsibilities, it would make everybody's life a little bit better. And that's really what Service Mesh is trying to do, right? Like it's trying to give a kind of consistent set of features that help application developers get their job done. Obviously, that initial messaging is very targeted at a kind of platform engineering or application persona, and rightfully so. But when you start to look at ambient mesh architecturally, right, the two layers, certainly the lower layer looks much more like some of the traditional VPN infrastructure that network engineers might be used to, and so might resonate a little bit more clearly with them. And I wouldn't say we've done a ton yet to try and engage with that audience, but we're certainly thinking about it. And so, there's certainly, also, as you mentioned, architecturally, like there's a fair amount of similarity between what we do and some of the maybe more modern networking tools. Like I'm not sure that IPsec and kind of, BGP based, data collection and gateway based models are the best, because we're still trying to be zero trust and end to end with that. But if you look at maybe more modern VPN solutions like WireGuard and Tailscale, you'd see a lot of similarities between what we do in Istio and what they do. And so, hopefully that resonates a bit more clearly with the traditional network engineering audience.
Absolutely. I truly believe that we should be doubling down on the network engineering folks and really teaching them more about how something like ambient mesh would be heavily applicable to them, but also highly relatable to them. But I think it also comes down to the conversation of breaking down those organizational silos and bringing those network engineers into the mix of what we do in cloud native. And I say that because I am that person. Having spent a lot of time in the networking world, it was a huge leap to try and get into understanding how service mesh worked before ambient mesh came along. And while I was digging into it, and when ambient mesh got launched, I started to realize, oh, this is literally the same thing that I used to do way back when we needed to connect branch offices together, except you'd have to sit there and manually put in your pre-shared key, define your peers, etc. All of this, all of those conceptual ideas have made its way into ambient. So it's really exciting for me as a network engineer to see that all over again. I just wish we spend more time talking to other network engineers about this technology. Anyways, enough of me ranting about that.
No, it's a good point. And actually, there's a much more kind of rubber meets the road point here as well. If you're a large enterprise, right, and you have a platform team and a networking team and an application development team and so on and so forth, Conway's law applies in purchasing decisions. And so what you see, right, like the platform team purchases a service mesh, the application team purchases frameworks, and the networking team purchases network security tools, and maybe there's another team purchasing an API management platform. And there's a huge amount of functional overlap between these tools, right? They do a lot of the same things, and yet all the purchasing decisions are made independently. And in aggregate, this is actually probably costing people a lot of money. And I think there's, maybe the platform team is in many organizations a newer stakeholder in these discussions, but they kind of act as a bridge between the application engineer and the networking engineer. And, you can see in conversations with them that they're seeing, right, this tension in how organizations make acquisition decisions. And often they're tasked with solving the problem, even though they're quite new often in organizations. And so this is a conversation I actually end up having quite often, which is interesting, right? I would say the last 18 months, I'm hearing this conversation quite a bit more than I would have heard it before. And it's real, right? Like, a lot of money gets spent on networking tooling in organizations. So these overlaps and ability for synergy between them is actually a pretty important thing, right, to the bottom line and cost structure of enterprise infrastructure.
Love the reference to Conway's law. I think that too often we get boiled down in technological problems and discussions, when there is more often than not a very human and organizational element to all of this. Marina, I talked about this when I did that DevOps Days Minneapolis talk about a year ago, and how even from the beginning of evaluating, do you need a service mesh? I think Conway's law is very appropriate. And so, I think when we look at the number of solutions out there, mesh being a part of that, that look to try to offer users a single pane of glass through which to monitor their systems, through which to kind of create this single view of the world that's very attractive to organizations because it helps to reduce some of the, we'll say, some of the duplication of effort across the organization. And so, I think that the more that we can do to try to reach people across different silos of an organization, the more we can do to help to articulate the value proposition of Service Mesh, because ultimately Service Mesh, it is a networking tool. It's a traffic management tool. It's a network. It's a security tool. It's also an observability tool. It enhances so many different things, and I think part of what we need to continue to do as folks who are a part of the Istio project, a part of the mesh ecosystem, is to help organizations understand how it fits in, not just for the application developers, but for their entire organization, and to really make that a clear understanding. So big plus one. I feel like we talk about Conway's Law. I'm hearing it more frequently, but I still feel like it's not enough. I think a lot of the technical problems that we end up talking about boil down to it.
We talk about Conway's Law in my organization, Keith. I'm sure your organization talks about it all the time, but we don't talk about it together.
Agreed. This is true.
Sorry, that's a Conway's Law joke for those. I don't get to do that very often.
Kat, I think you have a question as well. Go for it.
Oh, hey, no, the Conway's Law stuff is really awesome. I always like to talk about systems and system engineering and automation in human terms. So, for any of the listeners who haven't come across that before, Conway's Law is summarized kind of the belief that businesses will create systems that mirror how the business is structured and the policies that are part of the business culture and things like that. So thanks y'all for always adding the fun trivia to the conversation. I don't know how much time we have left, but I know that like when it comes to talking about the kind of the cost and complexity of eBPF and WASM interfaces in traditional mesh and reimagining the implications of those technologies in the ambient mesh, and it still being fairly early days. What kind of thoughts do you guys have as far as how ambient affects those conversations and architecture decisions, and how can we actually own the concepts in a way that might be friendly to the more Kubernetes-minded individual, even if maybe we don't have all of the networking expertise and such that makes the subtleties of those conversations easy for some of the contributors.
Yeah, I can start with the eBPF and WASM. In fact, I have a talk next Monday at WASM Day about extending Istio Ambient Service Mesh with WASM. So recently I got a demo actually working with WASM with Waypoint proxy. So yes, we do plan to support WASM extension as part of our layer 7 processing layer in Ambient. There is no intention, which I think is the right way, to support WASM extension in the layer 4. That's the secure overlay layer we discussed earlier, right? So that's a per node proxy, very high performance, provide zero trust tunnel. So that one is going to be that proxy is going to focus on layer 4 minimum functionality. By the way, we call it Z tunnel, zero trust tunnel. So the Waypoint proxy will support WASM extension. As far as the eBPF, I believe that the Istio community actually added eBPF support for Ambient a while back. I think was maybe early this year when we first launched Ambient. Shortly after, somebody from Dow Cloud and maybe and the Intel team also, they contribute the eBPF support to Ambient to allow us to accelerate the communication between the Zero Trust tunnel to the application pod using eBPF was using IP tables. So as we were trying to graduate Istio as a graduation project in CNCF, you guys all probably heard there was some legal battle related to eBPF. So we backed that code off. I think recently there's an initiative, there was a PR to add that code back. So might already been added back. So we have given some thoughts on eBPF as far as in the network layer to accelerate, shortcut the connectivities between Z-tunnel and the application pod. And that's where we see relevance of eBPF. We don't believe eBPF would be a good fit for either mutual TLS or for layer 7 processing. So there is no plan, as far as I know, in the Istio project to adopt eBPF for those purposes. So I want
No,
to
there's no plan.
add Louis.
No, I think Lynn gave an good overview. In general, I would say within the Istio project are kind of like WASM and eBPF are both kind of VMs, right? Like if it's a good way to think about them, they're kind of secure encapsulated VMs that you can embed inside something else. In eBPF's case, you can embed the VM inside the kernel. In the WASM's case, you can embed it inside other kind of user space applications, and in our case, Envoy. But obviously, what we do at the network level, and in particular MTLS, which you cannot really implement in the kernel at all. There's no way to do that really. In general, we think of eBPF as a great tool to decide how to route traffic within different functions running on a machine, right? And whether it's piping packets from one network interface to another, or from one user space application to another, or between the network and the user space application in our case, which would be Z-tunnel. But for implementing very complex systems, right? And a good example of this would be HTTP parsing, right? It's almost impossible to correctly parse HTTP in the kernel using eBPF code. While people like to talk about HTTP being a simple protocol, every HTTP header is really its own protocol. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure, some of those headers include Unicode parsing. And so embedding a whole Unicode parser that's ISO compliant into the kernel is probably not the best use of your time. And so, in general, there's this threshold beyond which you say it's better to do what I could have maybe in theory, or maybe just not be possible to do in eBPF, do it in user space, right? Where we have all the power available to us, right? And it's not like eBPF obviates the need for user space, right? We're not all of a sudden going to start compiling every application and running them all inside the kernel. That just doesn't make any sense. So that's our approach, and so far it's working very well. And we don't see that we would really lose any performance compared to trying to perform some of the equivalent functions in the kernel. And eBPF has a lot of kind of programming constraints in how you build systems. And so in using standard developer tooling and languages and runtimes and libraries, we're able to have a system that's also much more understandable, which, that really only matters to people actually writing this code, but it matters in the long run in terms of maintenance and security bug fixes and things like that. So that's our general approach. We use eBPF to accelerate piping packets between the different parts of our stack, and it works quite well. But I don't expect to start piling on lots and lots of new technology and build more and more stuff into eBPF. I don't think we'll be doing that.
All right, final question for y'all, and this is more for the future. So I'm sold on Ambient Mesh. I love it. It's fantastic. My business is, seeing the value. I want to know what that path is to production. I want to know if I can start using this today. I know it's experimental and open source. Are there ways to get it into production?
Yeah, I can start. I actually saw somebody also asking in the chat, what prevents Ambient being production ready? So I'll answer that together. So basically, the community are working very, very hard to drive Ambient to beta. In Istio, when a feature reaches beta, that's when we believe it's production ready for you to use it in production with caution. So what we are trying to do as a community is produce a narrow focused functionality that we think is production ready, and make Ambient available for everyone to try. So we believe that will be just single cluster, no multi-cluster, no virtual machine, just focus on very, very narrow set of function. We also believe when user first adopting Ambient, most likely they would not be using sidecar today, because if they're using sidecar, they're probably happy with Istio, and they probably wouldn't be motivated to move to Ambient in the first place. So we are going to optimize the list of functionalities. We will try to make Ambient production ready to be net new users of Istio who are not using Istio sidecar today, who probably look at Istio in the past but didn't want to stuck with the sidecar, right? So that's kind of the functionality we are looking at. There's even some discussions in the community about maybe we should just get the layer 4 processing the layer 4 secure overlay layer ready first. But that doesn't quite feel like a service mesh without the layer 7 processing layer. So we're still discussing that. I would say the biggest hurdle right now in the community is the CNI integration, right? Most of you probably running a particular CNI already in your Kubernetes cluster. And right now, Ztano and our Istio CNI are not very compatible with many of the CNIs out there that have network policy enforced. So that's probably the biggest hurdle, I would say, to get Ambient to production ready. I don't know if Keith, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think you covered, Lynn, most of the hurdles. The general, I guess I'll give a very general answer, is that we want Ambient Mesh to live up to the Istio name. So many people rely on Istio in production and have for years at this point. And we want it to be Istio quality. And we also want to make sure it's something that we prepare the community for, which is, where you will see these spaces and maybe even some surveys, and just trying to make sure that we're solving the problems that the community is experiencing. So if you've got feedback, if you're intrigued by Ambient Mesh, if you've got things you want to see, please. I think there's a link to the Slack channel shared. Please give us that feedback, open GitHub issues, because we ultimately want to make sure Ambient Mesh is something that can be used to make your life easier.
Louis, you've unmuted. I don't know if you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's obviously, going live in production, and then there's getting a feel for what the system is going to be like to operate. Ambient Mesh is certainly the alpha in the current release, but what works pretty well. And so if people are interested in getting, some operational experience with this in kind of pre-production environments, I'd certainly encourage them to give that a go. Not for production yet, right? I wouldn't do that. But something that looks like it, certainly. And that would also give you a good idea of, not just what it would take to do operations on it, what the UX would be like for you as an operator or as an application developer, like a namespace owner, and also what you would expect to see in kind of performance and resource utilization dynamics. And so, just like anything else, right, we should be staging applications, and we should also be staging infrastructure to production. And so if you have a pre-production environment or a test environment that you use Istio in, then there's no reason to not get started today. And also the project would appreciate the feedback. So I think there's mutual benefit there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing all that. Just wonderful information, deep insights into Ambient Mesh and its engineering. So if folks are already using Istio in production today or are looking to get a leg up on Ambient Mesh and want to provide some feedback, join the Istio Slack. Go check that out and drop in some of that feedback, just like Keith suggested. Also open up PRs too, or issues if you're running into things while running Ambient. All right, we are going to wrap up. So I just want to say thank you all. Thank you, Lynn, Keith, Louis. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Kat and Akansha, for showing up and providing some excellent questions for our guests here. So this recording will be available for you all to go back and catch some bits that you might have missed earlier on. I wish you all a happy Tuesday, a happy Halloween, and we will catch you all in a couple of weeks. And if you're at KubeCon, come say hi. We will be hanging around at sessions at the Colo events, at our booths, at the Microsoft booth, at the Solo booth, at the Istio booth, and come check us out. Take care.